The climate crisis is often spoken about in terms of facts and figures. Emissions to be cut and rising temperatures to be avoided. But what about the people who are trying to ensure we hit these numbers? How do they think? What drives them? And who inspires them? On this new series of Leaders with Lacqua Goes Green, I'll be speaking to key decision makers across a range of industries to learn how they're navigating the most pressing issue of our time. I begin with the man who's driving clean energy policy in the White House as part of a special conversation at the Bloomberg Green Summit in New York. This event attracts leaders from all walks of life, meeting at the crossroads of sustainability, science, and culture. So it's the perfect place to kickstart this new series, especially when it involves a holder of one of the top climate jobs in the US. I've come to meet political veteran John Podesta. His CV reads like a who's who in Washington. He served as chief of staff to former President Bill Clinton and as a climate advisor to Barack Obama. Now he's back serving the Biden administration, tasked with overseeing the largest climate investment in the country's history, the Inflation Reduction Act. It involves tax credits and incentives for carbon-free development to the tune of a massive $374 billion. It is not without controversy. Critics, including some of America's closest allies, say it gives unfair advantage to U.S. companies. Podesta can see the challenges, but overall, he's optimistic about the transition to a greener world. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you.
You only have a small job of implementing the Inflation Reduction Act and all the money that goes with it into the projects. Do you have the hardest job in Washington, the second hardest or the third hardest?
Well, definitely the president has the hardest job. I think the chief of staff has the second hardest. I know that from experience. And then, but this is a lot of blocking and tackling. I thought it'd be easy to give away $370 billion odd dollars, but it turns out there's a lot to it, to try to get it right, to make sure that it's going to the right purposes, to do both the transition from fossil fuel-based energy to clean energy, but do it in a way that is going to pay dividends to the people who have often been suffered the most from pollution, from environmental degradation, et cetera. So we're trying to do all that at once. It's a huge project. And it will transform our economy, but it's really exciting to do.
So, John, you're one of the most well-respected people in Washington. You've been around the block. You're like a veteran. You were actually going to retire. So what brought you back to the White House?
I like to joke that I failed at retirement. I worked very hard on the outside. I was chairing a think tank that I founded called the Center for American Progress, but worked very hard to see first and was, very happy that the president took this on during the course of the 2020 campaign, and then make good on it in the early days of the administration. We pushed for the legislation to pass. It was a little bit perils of Pauline, it died 4 or 5 times, but it came back to life. And so when it did pass and the president asked me to come back to the White House and try to help implement it, I had a lot of experience in government, so he had confidence that I would add value in that enterprise. I thought it was, if you can help out, you should do it, particularly against a crisis that I've been working on really for the better part of a generation. I started with President Clinton in the White House, really focused towards the end of the administration on the security and both the human security and the national security consequences. And then I've kind of made a career out of being a climate advocate.
Sometimes I imagine every day you have a difficult conversation with someone. Who do you think about to keep going on climate change? Do you think about your kids? Is it someone that inspired in your youth? Like, how do you just think this is the right thing to do and we won't stop?
I think about all the people who really need to lead better lives. My kids are grown, My grandkids are kind of tackling this as college students. But there's a future out there for a lot of young people. I had the honor of serving on the Secretary General's high-level panel that wrote the first draft of the Sustainable Development Goals. traveled all around the world and talked to young people, and that's both inspiring and it gives you a sense of responsibility about what are their lives going to look like, what are the jobs of the future going to be like, how are they going to have livelihoods that make sense, not just in the United States, which I'm first and foremost concerned about, but globally, and particularly in developing economies. So every day I think, well, you do what you can. You can't. This is not the kind of a problem that you turn a switch on, you solve overnight. But you make progress. You go forward. You try to always, as I said, do what you can.
So what's changed actually in the last 2 to 3 years? It feels like there's a lot more focus on climate change and sustainability.
Yeah. I think we stopped asking the question, what do we shut down? And we started asking the question, what do we need to build? And that was, I think, a happier story, one that the American public could get behind. And I think you also are taking advantage of the deep cost reductions. Solar power is now the cheapest power to deploy in the United States, and that's why you see it growing exponentially, both domestically but also globally. 75% of the new power generation is going to come from solar over the next 5 years. So we're taking advantage of trends that are already there, but the climate crisis requires us to accelerate that. And I think that's what's exciting about this moment. I think that I worked for President Obama as well on climate change, and at that point we were trying to reduce emissions by the middle of the century by 80%. That's where the world was. We had to. The problems were severe. Severe weather was both adding to again the tremendous cost burden on economies, but it was also upending human security around the globe. And so 80% seemed like a good deal. And then in 2018, the IPCC did what was called the 1.5 report. What was the difference between what a 2-degree world looked like and what a 1.5 degree world? And the catastrophe to the planet between those two poles led everybody to conclude that actually the job is bigger. We have to go to net zero. And that's a transformation of the global economy on the size and scale that's never occurred in human history. So that's a kind of daunting task, but it's full, I think, also of challenge, opportunity, the chance for innovation, and the chance to have the private sector play a fundamental role in making that change happen.
I think most citizens understand the benefits and getting to the goals, but the divisions politically get wider and wider. Why?
Well, I think if you look at where the American public is, there's relatively broad support for clean energy across the political spectrum. It's stronger amongst Democrats than it is amongst Republicans, and independents are, as usual, kind of like in the middle. But that's not reflected in our political arena. And I think one of the things that's occurred, some of that is vested interests that invest in politics to produce that result. Some of it's disinformation that is rampant.
So how do you match, the clean energy future with more drilling? And I know allies across the world are always saying, well, U.S., because of the size and scope, should be doing so much more.
Look, we're still, the world still is powered, particularly in transportation, on oil and fossil fuels. The result of the Russian brutal invasion of Ukraine and the use of fossil fuels as a weapon against Europe and the resistance to that invasion has meant that Europe needed new supplies of natural gas. So those are issues that are real, and the market has adjusted to that, partly through policy, but partly through a swing to try to supply Europe. The United States has now become the largest supplier to Europe of natural gas. But over time, we have to change that, quite frankly.
Coming up, Podesta argues why the energy transition will usher in changes even more profound than the rise of the internet. White House climate advisor John Podesta is a political operative who's seen it all, working with multiple presidents over the past several decades. And yet he thinks the climate crisis will bring in changes unlike anything seen in human history. So, John, 5 years from now, how will you look back at 2023? Is it the start of something or an actual turning point?
Yeah, I really feel like it is a turning point of it, and it is a transformation that was, you know, I lived through the in the earlier part of my career, seeing the power of what the internet did and what communications and information technologies did to our economy. I think this is even more profound than that. And it's at a global scale to transform an energy system that is huge, incumbent, but it's got to happen fast if we're going to have a planet that's livable and have a secure future for our children and grandchildren.
So no turning back. How do you future-proof anything that you're putting in place right now?
Look, I think this bill, I describe it as being sticky. You know, it's because really, as I said, it's really built around a strategy of investment and private sector investment. The supports that are included in this bill are quite different than what we've seen in the past in the U.S., which is 10 years of predictability so that you can plan big things, you can make big business decisions, you can deploy capital that will pay returns over an extended period of time. And again, you're seeing companies both at the startup and small business level as well as large industrial corporations taking advantage of that. But once it happens, once there's steel in the ground, once those jobs are created, once people have the capacity, really even at a consumer level, to get the cost reductions, the benefits from cleaner technologies, both in terms of public health, but also in cost reductions, very, very hard to turn that back.
Are investors behind you? So this is because this is, you know, government-led but private money. When they have questions,
well,
does it come from?
I think it's really amazing, actually. There's already been more than $200 billion of announced investment in clean energy technologies. That covers virtually everything from electric vehicles, batteries, reshoring of new investments in critical minerals in the United States and amongst our friends and partners. We're seeing solar supply chain come back to the United States, announcements about the manufacturing of modules here, deployment happening all over the place. We've got challenges. There's no question about it. We kind of forgot how to build things in America in a sense that permitting is tough. We need to reform the system for permitting clean projects in particular. We've got challenges.
In terms of what, how to do it, or in terms of finding the right funding?
We absolutely have to do a better job of resolving problems earlier and moving faster. So to give you an example of that, if we're going to meet the power sector goals in terms of clean energy deployment, we have got to add 60% to our transmission system. In order to do that by 2030, we have to double the speed in which we're permitting transmission. There are projects on the drawing board, but they often take too long to come to fruition. That's a problem both at the federal, state, and local government level, but we need And we're doing some things about that using our executive authority, but we could sorely use some legislation to just speed that up, not push communities out of the decision-making process, but bring them in earlier so that you understand the context for where there is an environmental problem, what's the workaround, can you mitigate it, get that done faster, earlier, and get the stuff built.
Do you spend a lot of time talking to climate change deniers?
Well, I encounter climate change deniers. I mean, it's kind of like I say, at this point, you really just have to open the window and look outside to know that climate change is happening, and it's happening in a way that's creating tremendous risk in the system. You see the huge spike in the damage that's being done by extreme weather, whether that's hurricanes, droughts, floods. There was money in the bill that I'm in charge of trying to implement to deal with the mega drought that's occurring in the Southwest. We're working with the Colorado River Basin states to see what the future is going to look like there, to kind of reduce the way we utilize water in the system to get kind of long-term benefit of that. I mean, it's everywhere. But
people don't see it. I mean, some people don't see it.
Well, I think they see it and they deny it. I mean, I think that's, I guess that's true about everything. But, I think for the vast number of people, they know it's happening. It used to be that, as again, from thinking about this from public attitude and politics, it used to be people recognized it, but they thought it was, way off in the future, not a priority for government. And I think that's changed too. Again, there's difference across the political spectrum between Democrats and Republicans on that matter, but people see this as an urgent problem, particularly independents and Democrats do. And I think they see the benefits of transforming the economy as being real, as both coming to their communities, creating jobs.
Coming up, Podesta reveals his future vision of clean energy and how it underpins his top piece of advice for any leader trying to build a more sustainable world. The transition to a more sustainable world is critical if humankind is to survive on this planet. And for John Podesta, it goes hand in hand with driving economic growth in the US and across the globe. How do you measure success? So will you only be successful when you no longer have a job because it's the departments that think about sustainability within their budgets?
Yeah, well, look, I think this is always going to be a project of the White House, and maybe that's because I'm a White House-centric guy. I don't know, but I do. But we've got a terrific team in the cabinet. President's put together tremendous leaders across the cabinet, and they're seized with this. And just to go back to these problems: workforce, permitting, supply chains, etc. Things like permitting, workforce, those weren't tackled at the cabinet secretary level. They are in this administration. We meet regularly amongst our kind of sub-cabinet of people who are charged with this. Gina Raimondo at the Commerce Department, the Deb Haaland at Interior, our Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, our Secretary Vilsack at USDA. We meet regularly to work through specific issues, specific problems, project by project, to make sure we're on task, on time, and that didn't happen. I think because we're doing that, maybe we're setting a standard for future administration.
Do you have like a green technology or climate change utopia? Or do we need to travel less, eat less meat? What does it look like?
Sure. After we spend a lot of money on fusion, we'll have cheap and ubiquitous power that's carbon free and can power everything. But I'm being a little bit just cute here. I think if you look at these the change that's happening, I think you got to go sector by sector, and that push for investment and innovation is happening across the board. That creates growth, that creates momentum, that creates sustainability, and I feel like if you think about big waves in the economy that power the future growth, clean energy, again, it's clean buildings and better agricultural practices, better forestry practices. That is really going to be the driver of the future growth of the economy here and around the globe.
But how cheap does it have to be to rival, and also for clean energy?
As I said, clean power is already cheaper than fossil power. The deployment of solar is cheaper than fossil fuels. Now we've put some support behind that with investment tax credits, production tax credits, as have Europe, China, other places. But that drive towards innovation is going to lower costs. One of the things that people question us sometimes about we get it from the perspective of U.S. investment, what's it going to do for the world? And BCG did an analysis at the end of last year that predicted that these clean energy technologies will cost reduction curve will be on the order of 25% by the end of the decade, just as a result of this bill. That means for every dollar or euro or yen or that's invested, it can go that much further. You're buying 25% more of clean product, and that's, I think, very important for the developing world and developing economies. Both the large economies like India, South Africa, Indonesia, but also across Africa, you're going to see the cost curve driving the ability to deploy these clean technologies going down, and that's a global public good.
I know there are a lot of leaders here or actually watching us from home. What's your number one advice to be a green leader in 2023? How can you be a green leader? What's your advice to anyone who wants to be a green leader?
I think you have to set a goal that's not too far out in the future. I would say you ought to have a plan for what you're doing over the next few years, but I think particularly for business executives, what is 2030 going to look like for you? And what does your enterprise look like today? How far, there's a lot of net zero pledges out there. Bunch of them are out at the mid-century level, which is, I think, consistent with where governments are in 2045 or 2050. China and India are 2060. But I think that it's not good enough to have a 2050 goal if you're not charting the progress to that and you don't have concrete plans for what you're going to do to really develop a sustainable business enterprise in this decade. This is the decisive decade. So I think people really should be measured by that, and investors should be demanding that. And I feel like that is in fact kind of happening in the marketplace.
John Podesta, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.